Nintendo Space World 2000. It is here the Big N showed off their anticipated hot new home console and its launch lineup set to release the next year. At the top of the press conference was a sizzle reel of games showing Pokemon, Wave Race, Star Wars, and then Metroid Prime. Did you hear that excited response? Nintendo wasn't expecting that, especially from a Japanese audience. Metroid didn't sell well that side of the Pacific. They realized they needed to capitalize on this. So they struck while the iron was hot. A 2D Metroid game was quickly greenlit for development. Metroid series co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto was leading the development team at R&D 1, and they were wrapping up their work on Wario Land 4 for the Game Boy Advance. They would soon be free to develop the project. So Sakamoto was given the assignment, and it would have to release the same day as Metroid Prime, in about a year and a half.
Oh my God!
A quick brief history of Nintendo's research and development departments. By the late 90s, early 2000s, Nintendo had gone through a lot of restructuring around their video game business. In the late 60s, early 70s, Nintendo transitioned from manufacturing playing cards to becoming a toy company. It all began in the manufacturing division. R&D 1 was formed in the early 70s. Gunpei Yokoi led the department, making electronic games and toys. They would also get into arcade game development and then also Famicom NES development when those products released. R&D 2 was formed in the early 70s as well. It was led by Masayuki Umera. I really hope I pronounced that name right, I probably didn't. They started out making light gun games for the arcade and then moved into making plug-and-play electronic games for the TV at home. Obviously, the Famicom/NES would come from this department. They would also act as a developer, doing mostly ports from arcade to the Famicom/NES. R&D 3 would also form in the 70s and be led by Genyo Takeda. They developed arcade hardware tech and did some game development. They helped out R&D 2 with the Famicom Game Pack design. The last R&D department was formed after Miyamoto's success with Donkey Kong and his other arcade games. He would move from R&D 1 to be the creative lead for his own department, R&D 4. They would become the main software development arm for the NES. And for a short while, this setup worked, with each department having some overlap. As the video game business grew, in the 90s, things changed. Miyamoto's R&D 4 department was spun off into its own division, Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development, or Nintendo EAD for short. They would mostly do home console game design. R&D 3 would transition into the hardware designer for the 3D era of gaming. They would design the N64 and its peripherals, and the GameCube and its peripherals. In 2000, R&D 3 would be spun off into its own division. It'd be renamed Nintendo Integrated Research and Development, or Nintendo IRD. R&D 2 would split in the 90s. A new division would form called Nintendo Special Planning and Development. They would work on unique hardware ideas to expand the business, like the Satellaview for the SNES. The hardware and software this team created wouldn't be seen outside of Japan. What was left of the original R&D 2 department would spend the rest of the 90s and early 2000s porting Super Mario games to the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. In 2004, when Umera retired, the department was shuttered and the remaining staff absorbed into Nintendo Special Planning and Development. In the meantime, R&D 1 would become the handheld gaming department, making games for the Game Boy, and also worked on some experimental tech that would become the Virtual Boy, which failed spectacularly. Gunpei Yokoi would work on one last project with Nintendo, the Game Boy Pocket, and then he would leave the company to start his own venture, but was sadly killed in a car accident in 1997. R&D 1 would split. Software development staff would remain with the original R&D 1, working on Game Boy titles. Satoru Okada, who helped develop the Game Boy and is really responsible for the reason the Game Boy was the Game Boy, would take the hardware team over into a new department called Nintendo Research and Engineering Department, or Nintendo RED, and they would continue designing handheld consoles. By the year 2000, this is what Nintendo looked like. Nintendo IRD handled home console design, with Nintendo EAD handling game development for those home consoles. Nintendo RED designed the handheld hardware, while R&D1 handled the game development for those handhelds. R&D2 is just kinda hanging out for Yumera to retire. And Nintendo Special Planning and Development was working on fun experiments never to be seen outside of Japan. So when Nintendo decided they needed to make the handheld Metroid game to coincide with Metroid Prime's release, it made sense to hand the project over to R&D1. They were the handheld division, and, bonus points, home to Metroid's co-creator. There was a problem. With all this restructuring throughout the 90s, not many developers from Super Metroid were still on the team. They had spent the last 8 years making Game Boy titles, most of which were Wario Land games and Game & Watch Gallery games. Sakamoto had his work cut out for him. He handed the project to a few designers to get started while the rest of the team wrapped up work on Wario Land 4. They immediately came back to him with an insane request. They wanted to completely redesign Samus. They felt she had looked the same for far too long. Sakamoto told them not to take this lightly. This would be massively consequential. Despite the Metroid series being the red-headed stepchild of Nintendo franchises, Samus was still a recognizable and popular character. Metroid Prime's first looks were making waves. Sakamoto didn't want to harm the brand, but he also didn't want to hamper creativity. So he gave his team a charge. Don't think of design ideas first. Come up with an in-game narrative reason for the redesigned suit, and then go from there. That way, they'd be getting the player invested in the redesign, and coming up with possible gameplay mechanic ideas as well. The designers worked on their ideas. Before they dove too deep into development on the new Metroid, Sakamoto also had them play the old Metroid games and analyze them. The team needed to understand what a Metroid game was. His team of younger designers thought those original games were really hard, like a masochistic Nintendo game of yore. Some of you may know the term Nintendo hard when referring to those old NES games. One of the ideas this team had at the forefront was how to make these beloved games more accessible while still keeping some element of the difficulty that Metroid fans enjoyed. A very tightrope to walk. And it's this desire that would influence the layout for Metroid Fusion's structure. Metroid Fusion would take a different approach to the Metroid formula. Obviously, Samus was redesigned with a more colorful bioorganic look. The team had figured out a really good narrative reason, which led to some interesting design choices. Samus was infected with an X-parasite that wormed its way into her power suit, which then had to be surgically removed from her body. She was saved by a vaccine made from the Metroid larva, and she was reborn as a fusion between human and Metroid. Oh! I get it now. I'm kidding, I've always known. Please don't hate me in the comments. Her suit and the X-parasite samples are sent to a space station orbiting SR-388, the homeworld of the Metroids. And of course, things go awry, and she has to head back to that station to figure out what's going on. As she investigates, she gains new equipment and abilities, fights monstrous bosses, and explores every nook and cranny of the station, like any other Metroid game. So how is this one different? Samus in the NES Metroid game controlled like butt. Alright, I'm exaggerating, I know, but comparatively speaking, that's not her at her best. At the time, it was fine, but we know better now. In Super Metroid, there was a vast improvement to how she handled, but there was still a slight learning curve with her floatiness. She felt ironically heavy. Metroid Fusion is the first Metroid game, in my opinion, to make Samus really feel agile. She still had some floatiness to her jump for mid-air control, but her other movements were snappier and more precise. It felt like you could get into a groove. The acrobatics this time had a crunch to them that you just didn't have in the previous games. She could also hang on ledges and climb on ladders on the walls and ceilings. Her moveset got a massive upgrade. She also had that crunchiness that made it feel good to control, like Mario. Part of me can't help but wonder if Super Smash Bros. Influenced this, since that was a platform fighter and was known for its quick and chaotic combat. Every character was fast and snappy in that game, and most players would have known Samus from that rather than her own series. And this is just an assumption, but I would bet dollars to donuts that Smash influenced how her game feel would be in Fusion. Obviously, this is just speculation. Don't quote me on this. Items and abilities are mostly the same with a few changes. There's still the Varia and gravity suits, the high jump, space jump, and screw attack. You get missiles, bombs, and beam upgrades. In all actuality, there are not really any new items or abilities, just some small but very meaningful changes, notably with missiles and the ice beam. Because there was a lack of buttons on the GBA versus the SNES, controls had to be simplified. So to toggle missiles, instead of hitting select, you held down the R button. The select button did nothing for some reason. This meant you wouldn't be able to toggle between missiles and super missiles. So they just made super missiles an upgrade to missiles that up their damage output. The narrative reason for Samus's design spilled over to other parts of the game design. Since she had Metroid DNA, she'd be susceptible to the cold, right? Would that affect her ability to even wield the ice beam? The team decided, yeah, it would, so she wouldn't get it. Rather, the ice beam ability would be attached to missiles, making the ice effect tied to your ammo capacity. This did two things. It gave you the option to freeze enemies only if you wanted to, but it also made you think twice before doing so. A missile used to freeze an enemy is a missile you no longer have to fight another enemy or boss. Now, missile drops and recharge stations are aplenty in the game, and if you spent time exploring and finding missile tank upgrades, this really wasn't a problem. But it's still an interesting idea that would make a player think twice before using an ice missile needlessly. The one new ability is the diffusion missile, which makes the missiles charge like a charge beam, and a spiraling ice effect would emanate from the epicenter of its detonation, thus freezing everything on screen, which can be helpful. But aside from these changes, abilities and items are largely left unchanged. Metroid, Metroid 2, and Super Metroid showed you their stories. You pieced them together as you played the game based on level design and in-game visuals. Super Metroid in particular mastered this. Aside from the opening cutscene, everything was conveyed through art direction and gameplay. Watching that baby Metroid sacrifice itself for you was an emotional moment back in 1994. Metroid Fusion told you its story. Sakamoto really wanted to add cutscenes and dialogue to flesh out the story beats and the character of Samus. Originally, he had pieced together Super Metroid's opening cinematic on a VHS tape, and evidently never forgot the experience. So he really wanted to add more to this next Metroid title, and boy did he. Fusion is filled with inner monologues from Samus and dialogue from her AI commanding officer telling her what to do and how to do it, which at times she just blatantly disregards. There are also brief cutscenes to show you the main antagonist of the game, yourself. Bum bum bum! It's actually the X-Parasite mimicking your suit and its abilities at full power. The SAX is a pretty frightening foe the few times she shows up. There are criticisms to Sakamoto's approach, and some fans don't really like the heavy-handed cutscenes and monologues. I personally don't mind it because there's still plenty of other environmental storytelling, like the larvae in Section 2, which block off paths and part of the level. And on subsequent visits, they hatch and evolve, and that section becomes more decrepit and overrun with the fauna and bugs. The station is spiraling out of control as you progress. There's also Section 5 and the big glass cage in the background. Every so often, a big hulking shadow flies by in a fast blur. Later on, it escapes, and when you revisit, all the glass is broken, and you know you're gonna have to take this thing down. Lastly, there is the SAX. You'll hear explosions in the distance, and parts and sections of the level will change as the SAX wreaks havoc. There's also moments where you encounter her and have to hide or run away. These are pre-scripted though, and don't happen at random. And they're pretty brief moments. But the SAX idea will be expanded in the next Metroid game. In 20 years. While the story is shoved in your face at every turn, there's still a lot of cool environmental storytelling. And you can see the effects of the events on the map. Speaking of the map, Metroid Fusion's map is definitely linear, to a frustrating degree. It constantly traps you in sections, and it feels arbitrary when it does so. Super Metroid would also expand and contract, and at one point does trap you in a small section in Norfair, but Metroid Fusion took a little bit of a different approach in how it did it. The map is split into 7 sections of the space station, the main deck, and then the 6 research biome sectors. At the front of each section is a navigation room that gives you a map of the section along with your objective. a save station, and a recharge station. The game is very straightforward. You get your mission, reach the target, complete your objective, return to the navigation room for your next mission. It almost feels like a level-by-level type progression. Now, the path to objectives wasn't always a straight shot. As I mentioned, the SAX and the other parasites were mucking things up. You'd have to discover hidden paths labeled with the sea green color on your map to reach your objectives. So exploration was still a necessary part. But I think what makes some players feel disappointed is the presentation of this limitation. You can't go back and explore other sections sometimes because the game says so. It feels like an arbitrary reason that strips agency from the player. That section in Super Metroid I mentioned a little bit ago, let's revisit that real quickly. You're stuck not because an AI says so, you're stuck because you're ill-equipped to get out. Once you find the power-ups you need, you can climb up that chasm. It makes you feel accomplished and smart. Yes, the game told you you can't go back up yet because it said so, but it was designed as a challenge to overcome without outright saying, no, you can't go back because I say so. Fusion doesn't do it that way. It just says, no, you can't do that. What is interesting is how the map changes as you revisit each section. Paths become blocked as the X-infested animals are wreaking havoc, changing the layout of the map. So as you revisit each section of the map, it feels a little fresh each time. And you need to explore more to find the hidden passageways around these blocked areas. But this is not what Metroid fans were expecting, or wanting really. A guided tour by the hand just didn't feel like Metroid. So why would Sakamoto make his staff play the previous games to learn what made them special, and then not design a game around the aspects that made them special in the first place? It appears they learned the wrong lessons. Or did they? Let's go on a tangent. Come with me back to 1995. Video games were big, I tell ya! Competition was growing, and the race to have the next innovative gadget was on. The Virtual Boy was about to be Nintendo's next big thing. And then it failed, promptly and quickly. After 6 months, the product would be discontinued. It was a quick and unceremonious demise. I mentioned in previous videos that the Game Boy was outdated hardware from the moment it released. Here's an amusing antidote. Shortly after it hit the market in 1989, a Nintendo employee sadly told Gunpei Yokoi that a competitor was releasing a handheld system that was more powerful. Yokoi asked, "Is it in color?" The dejected employee sadly responded, "Yeah." Yokoi said, "Oh good, we'll be fine." He knew that they had something that, while wasn't the latest and greatest, was still the best value. And he was right. While the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx faded, Game Boy sales stayed strong. But by 1995, Game Boy sales were waning, and the Virtual Boy was not helping things. While the Game Gear lagged behind the Game Boy, it did sell 11 million units, almost a quarter of Game Boy sales at the time. And Sega was introducing a handheld called the Nomad, which was a Sega Genesis in handheld form. If Sega could pull that off, this would change the name of the game, a full-fledged home console on the go. The enemy was at the gates, and Nintendo needed to be ready. After Yokoi's departure from Nintendo, Satoru Okada would take the handheld hardware division, ditch everything about the Virtual Boy, and begin work on something that consumers would actually want and not be such an eyesore, both literally and figuratively. Project Atlantis was born. It would be a 32-bit handheld that would be almost on par with the upcoming Nintendo 64's capabilities. It'd have a full-color backlit display with a 30-hour battery life, and would be ready for release in late 1996. Between their 64-bit home console that was coming out and this 32-bit handheld, Nintendo was going to dominate. And if that sounds too good to be true for the mid-90s, it's because it was. The handheld was too big and bulky, and it would be prohibitively expensive to manufacture. While Sega was willing to take the risk of a high-powered handheld with the Nomad, Nintendo opted to set their project aside. In the meantime, they would refresh the Game Boy with the Game Boy Pocket in 1996, and then again with a colored version in 1998, neither of which would bring a significant boost to its processing or graphical power. Nintendo's approach was more successful than Sega's. The Nomad sold only 1 million units. The Game Boy Pocket and Color, in conjunction with a hot new IP, reinvigorated Game Boy sales across the board. Home console gaming wasn't going to be coming to handhelds quite yet, but Nintendo hadn't given up on creating a true Game Boy successor. At Nintendo Space World in August 1999, word got out they were working on the next Game Boy. codenamed the Advanced Game Boy. A month later, in September, they officially announced the product. It would be called the Game Boy Advance. It would be a 32-bit handheld console slated for release sometime in the year 2000. The ship date would slip. Eventually, the GBA would hit store shelves in North America in June 2001. While it wasn't the powerhouse that was promised from Project Atlantis, it was a great next step for Nintendo's handhelds. It may not have hit Nintendo 64 levels of power, but it was like having a souped-up SNES in the palm of your hands, if it was missing 2 buttons. Despite the power, there were still caveats. The hardware development team begrudgingly added the shoulder buttons at the request of the software teams, but they wouldn't add 2 more face buttons. And the screen still wasn't backlit. This kept the cost down and the battery life up. One of the reasons Sakamoto didn't make a Metroid game beyond Super Metroid at this point was because of the limitations of the Game Boy hardware. He couldn't achieve his vision for how it would look, feel, and play. Well, the Game Boy Advance changed that. So when Sakamoto's team got the charge to make a game, he went for it. But his team at R&D1 had a specific skill set and sensibilities. They had spent the better part of a decade making smaller Game Boy games. While they did their homework on what made a Metroid game, it's hard to ask them to design a game in a way they are unfamiliar with. This is the reason Metroid Fusion was built on the Wario Land 4 game engine. That and because they only had a year to make it. In 1995, the team at R&D1 settled into their role as a dedicated handheld dev team. After they developed and released Super Metroid and Wario's Woods for the NES and SNES, they worked on Virtual Boy games and then moved back to Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, most of which were those Wario and Game & Watch collection games. And they did one N64 game for good measure. The team's views on handheld game design was that play sessions would generally be short, so the games had to be quick and easy to pick up and put down. If you wanted to spend an hour or 2 playing Wario, you can, but if you only had 20 minutes, say on a train during your commute to work, a player could knock out a level or 2 and feel like they accomplished something in that short period. Their games needed to strike that balance. No matter how long or short your playtime was, you felt satisfied making some sort of progression. That design philosophy would be brought to developing Metroid Fusion. Fuse this philosophy with Sakamoto's desire to flesh out Samus as a character and add more story elements to the game, you get a better understanding of why Metroid Fusion seems to deviate so much from Super Metroid's legacy. Players could park themselves in front of their TV for an hour or 2 and get lost in the world of Super Metroid, where part of the fun was finding that next objective that would advance their progression. If it took a couple of hours and very little progression was made, that's fine. At least some progression was made. The team had to translate that feeling to a console that would have a much shorter average play session time. Elements had to be streamlined, and goals had to be better telegraphed, if not just outright stated to the player. This is why Metroid Fusion is designed the way that it is. It's not that the team didn't understand what makes a Metroid game fun and interesting, they just needed to translate that feeling into a different medium. And at this time, handheld gaming was a different medium compared to home console gaming. A tangential aside, yes, I read the interviews with Sakamoto about what his team had to say about the OG Metroid games, and yes, there is an element where they said they were too hard, and you could argue they didn't truly understand what made a Metroid game, and like the NES Metroid, yeah, agreed, but Super Metroid? Really? It's not that hard. You may get lost, but it's not that hard. All this to say, I think Fusion gets a little too much flack for its linearity. When playing it, you need to adjust the lens you view it from. Not only is it not Super Metroid, it's not a Super Nintendo game. It's a Game Boy game. It is fundamentally meant to be played and interacted with in a different way. Once you do that, then you can make a more fair assessment about whether you like that or not. I'm not saying Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion are apples and oranges, they're both apples. They're just different types of apples. And it's okay to say, I like apples, but I don't like Granny Smiths. They're too tart for me.